Tennyson's life from 1809 to 1892 spanned much of the reign of Queen Victoria. She made him Poet Laureate to succeed Wordsworth in 1850, and upon the recommendation of Gladstone, raised him to the peerage as a baron in 1883. The adulation in his own time by people of all classes throughout the English-speaking world is probably unmatched in literary history. The events of 1850 occupy a central position in any examination of Alfred Tennyson's life. The publication and success of In Memoriam, together with Tennyson's marriage to Emily Selwood and his appointment as Poet Laureate, gave the year an irresistible narrative appeal to biographers and critics. Robert Bernard Martin states that between the publication of the poem in May and his accession to the laureateship in November, Tennyson's reputation had totally changed, and that the success of In Memoriam made him easily the most famous poet in England. Martin's statement contributes to the broad critical consensus which presents the publication of In Memoriam as a turning point in Tennyson's fortunes, transforming his reputation and leading directly to the other felicities of 1850. Thus, In Memoriam is Tennyson's most important poem. Therefore, it is necessary to consider the critical response to the poem in relation to the criticism of Tennyson's previous work. Isabel Armstrong comments that poetry, as understood by Victorian criticism, existed in a broad cultural context. Critics invariably ascribed a moral or social purpose to poetry beyond the pure literary, and this approach to criticism culminated in the idea of some exceedingly vaguely defined national poem. For many reviewers, In Memoriam seemed to meet the criteria for such a representative poem, and so it earned great praise. Thus, Victorian criticism celebrated the poem's importance in social rather than literary terms. Its genuine sympathy with the influences which assist the cause of human progress elevated it to the higher order of poetry and placed Tennyson among the great and moving spirits of the age. Among Tennyson's finest achievements are his mythical landscapes that symbolize states of human consciousness. The dreamlike quality of his vision, combined with his ability to see at close range, with preternatural clarity and detail, rendered his dreams more vivid than our realities. The distinction first made by Sir Harold Nicolson and reiterated by T.S. Eliot between the expression of Tennyson's personal experience with violence and alienation and the shadow and hypocritical public verse no longer satisfies. As we become more sympathetically aware of the complexities of the Victorian age, we become more and more aware of the anxious coexistence of their despair and optimism. In Memoriam is intensely personal, and yet is the archetypical presentation of the Victorians' tense dialogue of faith in mortal combat with doubt. Tennyson maintained throughout his career powers of keenest observation combined with an abnormally keen awareness of the anomalous state of man, a spirit incarnate in matter. Tennyson's characteristic note is one of ambivalence between certainty and doubt, past and present, illusion and reality. He incorporates these dichotomies into a vision which, especially in Memoriam and Idyllis of the King, constitutes a remarkable poetic achievement. It must be remembered, writes Tennyson in a note in Memoriam, that this is a poem, not an actual biography. I is not always the author speaking of himself, but the voice of the human race speaking through him. This being so, it would seem that in order to understand the poem, we need know nothing of the circumstances which occasioned it, any more than we require a knowledge of the lives of Shakespeare or of Gray in order to understand Hamlet or Elegy. But In Memoriam is not quite like Hamlet or Gray's Elegy. It rather resembles such a poem such as Adonais. Just as Adonais contains allusions which would not be fully intelligible to a reader ignorant of the literary history of the time, so In Memoriam contains references which can be understood but imperfectly from the poem itself. And as in this case, the persons and events referred to belong chiefly to private life, the reader cannot be assumed to have any knowledge of them at all. It is desirable, accordingly, to summarize the necessary information at once. The poem was written in the span of 17 years, on the death of Arthur Henry Hallam, son of Henry Hallam the historian. He formed an intimate friendship with Tennyson at the Trinity College, Cambridge, which lasted nearly 5 years. The friends traveled together on the Rhine and in France. Hallam visited Tennyson's home and became engaged to the poet's sister Emily. After leaving Cambridge, he began to read for the bar, living in his father's house in London. In the summer of 1833, he made a tour to the Connecticut. He made a tour to the continent with his father, and at Vienna on September 15th, he died very suddenly and unexpectedly of a stroke of apoplexy. His body was brought by sea from Tryst to England and was buried at Clevedon on the Bristol Channel on January 3, 1834. The poem contained references to many of these facts, and also to some matters not directly connected with Arthur Hallam. We can see this in various sections of the poem. The marriage tour in 1836 of the poet's brother Charles has been depicted in one of the sections. Edmund Lushington, who became professor of Greek at Glasgow, was a friend that he addressed in another section, and the epilogue celebrates his marriage with the poet's sister Cecilia in 1842. Tennyson's early home and the rectory of Somersby, halfway between Horncastle and Somersby in Lincolnshire, is referred to in many of his sections in the poem. To understand In Memoriam, a better approach would be to look at Tennyson's overall faith. Two important things here become necessary. The first is his all-important faith in immortality, and of secondary interest is his vision of the precise nature of a future life after the death of the body. Immortality is defined by him as the conscious and indefinitely prolonged life of the soul beyond death. Immortality is a fact of the same order as the existence of God. Thus, belief in immortality is the belief in God. They both are Tennyson's faith and are maintained so throughout his poetry. We first start by talking about the soul's history. So sometimes he imagines a previous existence or more than one in which the soul was either embodied or else floated free. And certain strange longings and dim visions which haunt its earthly life are regarded as faint recollections of a previous embodiment. But in Memoriam, the earthly life is thought of as the first life of the soul. It is then figured as something from the deep of a larger spiritual being, or as detaching itself or being detached from the general soul. This process is coincident with, or the spiritual complement of, certain changes in matter which issue in the body of the soul. And later, through experience gained by means of this body, the soul develops into self-consciousness, or personality. That which is deepest and most real in it is sometimes spoken of as free will. To Tennyson, the main miracle apparently an act of self-limitation by the infinite, and yet a revelation by himself of himself. Now let's talk about the soul's second life. At death, the union of the soul and body is dissolved. The idea that thereupon the soul passes at once to a final state of bliss or woe is on the whole foreign to the poet's mind, and is repudiated. So is the idea that at the end of the earthly life, the soul at once re-emerges into the general soul, so as to lose its individuality. And again, the idea that at death, the soul falls into a long sleep from which it awakes unchanged. Though it has been entertained as a possibility in one of the cantos of his poem, it is evidently not habitual with the poet. He habitually imagines the soul as entering on a second individual life immediately after death. The new life is almost always thought of as implying a new embodiment, and sometimes, perhaps generally, this embodiment is supposed to take place on some other world or star. The soul's second life, if it lived well on earth, is regarded as free from many of the limitations and defects of the first. Usually, the poet thinks of the soul as remembering its past and its earthly companions. Occasionally, he imagines it as being at least of a time peculiarly near to the beloved on earth, and perhaps even able to touch them without the intervention of sense. The second life is supposed to be succeeded by death, on which follows a third embodied life, and this process is repeated again and again for ages, the soul in each embodiment reaching a higher state of being and approaching more and more nearly to God. The union with God in which this progress would presumably terminate, the poet naturally does not attempt to imagine. But it is noticeable that if we may judge from one of his cantos in the poem, and the phrases quoted in his memoir, the idea of an ultimate absorption into the divine was not repugnant to him. And perhaps with this we may connect the fact that in the trance experience, which he several times described as the loss of personality, seemed to him no extinction but only true life. Of the future of souls which grew worse with time in their earthly state, he does not write, but, as his later poems show, he could not entertain the belief that any soul would, in the end, be excluded from a God of love. The larger hope of his poem, and perhaps the one far-off driven event to which the whole creation moves, are phrases which refer to the final reconciliation or union of all souls with their divine source. If we look at his views on nature, we'd see how Tennyson would say on looking through the microscope in his memoir, "Strange that these wonders should draw some men to God and repel others. No more reason in one than in the other." And so the poet in memoriam declares, "I have found him not in world or sun, or eagle's wing or insect's eye." Nay, in this dark hour it even seems to him that the message of nature is a terrible one. That red in tooth and claw with the ravine, she shrieks against his creed, that the world is a process of ceaseless change in which individual existences arise to pass without return, that its forces show no token that they value life more than death, good more than evil, or the soul more than a grain of sand. And though these are but evil dreams born of his distress, and nature appears to him far otherwise when he views it, as he habitually does, in the light of ideas derived from another source, he is still constant to the position that nature, regarded by itself, would not conceive him of immortality or God. Tennyson thinks that the emotions or heart cannot be satisfied without a belief in God and immortality, and that is the sole ground of his belief. And when he replies to the freezing reason, the feeling he appeals to is not the desire to be immortal, nor yet a feeling that he is immortal, but the feeling of love, which he points to as a fact inconsistent with the theory of the world put forward in his dark mood by this reason. Love implies, in its very nature, the immortality of both itself and its object. When the poet speaks of that, what he feels, there is a more direct appeal to something called feeling. Here the poet does not point to something within him which seems to imply immortality or God, but rather the feelings of which he speaks of are an immediate assurance of God or immortality. Even in his darkest hours, he embraced an undying love and imagined it to be God and the creation's final law. He embraced it, however, through feeling and by faith. He did not reach it by studying nature, nor could he prove its existence. But at the end, when the love within him has reached its full stature, his faith in love as the King and Lord of the universe has only become more fixed. And his friend, while deeply loved, had become mingled with his immortal love. This faith is not an adherence to something which reason declares false, but it is an adherence to something which reason cannot prove to be true. For that which can be known or proved is always a limited and subordinate truth, while the systems and creeds which strive to render intelligible to the soul the experience of her highest moments lack on one hand the assurance of those moments themselves, and on the other hand the certainty of the lower truths which can be proven and are not worthy proving. Loss may in the end be gain, but not if the gain be snatched at prematurely. To stifle sorrow at first would be to stifle love, and the final result would be the mere death of the old self, not its death into life. A main idea of the poem, that love is the supreme good and can defy time, is expressed at once in the opening section. This was Alfred Lord Tennyson. If you'd like to know more about the Victorian poets and Victorian authors, have a look at this lecture.